Welcome back. This is the video lecture for Chapter 12, Middle Childhood Cognitive Development. We are going to start here with slide 38. We are in Piagetian theory once again, and we are starting to move into the concrete operational thought era of development. So you'll remember that within Piaget's levels of thought and cognition, we start with our sensory motor, just learning the basics about how to move our bodies and understand what's happening, what's coming in through our senses. Then we move on to our pre-operational thought. Operational would be kind of our logical thinking. Pre-operational means it is not there. There are still a lot of very specific logical fallacies that are happening that prevent kids from fully understanding just basic logics about how the world works and how people interact with each other. Moving into concrete operational thought, we are starting to see the earliest levels of this logical thinking. However, it still tends to be very concrete, meaning very black or white. Things are right or things are wrong. There's not abstract thinking yet, and they're still having difficulties with a number of issues surrounding nuance and I don't know, abstractions, right? This example that we have here is asking a very simple question. Fritz is taller than Daphne. Daphne is taller than Nino. Who is taller, Fritz or Nino? And of course in this picture you can see who is taller, but if you ask this to like a 4-year-old who didn't have pictures that they could see, it would just stump them. They would have no idea how to begin to solve a problem like this. Whereas a 9-year-old would have the ability to logic out, okay, well if Fritz is taller than Daphne, then Daphne is taller than Nino, and would be able to kind of like sort out the levels for all of this. And this is evidence that they're moving into that concrete operational thought, that they're able to use this logical reasoning. Some of the issues that we see manifest during concrete operational thought are the ability to categorize things. People are able to create hierarchies, to create codes and patterns and groups in which things can go and be labeled. And they become, pretty good at this. By age 8, most children can classify to some extent or another. On slide 41, we're seeing some other logical concepts that are coming out. We have our transitive inference. So this is the ability to figure out the unspoken link between one fact and another. We also start seeing like verbal math problems and things like that, where kids are given a couple of pieces of information and then they have to figure out where to go from that to figure out what comes next, right? And so within this concrete operational stage, kids are developing that ability to understand that there is still information in what is not said, and they can figure out what that information is. Seriation is another kind of type of classification, but it's putting things in a specific order within a logical series. I remember I had like toys, it was pictures, and if you put them in a certain order, you could create a story, but you could also put them in another order in order to make another story. And so that ability to say this came first and then this and then this and this is why is something that we develop as in middle childhood. We're going to skip forward here to slide number 46. Working memory. So this is the short-term memory. These are the thoughts that we are holding in our head right now, things that we are actively thinking and working with. It's improving steadily and significantly. Kids are able to start holding more. Kids are able to start holding more and more information within their heads at the same time. And so this capacity for long-term memory is virtually limitless by the end of middle childhood, but they are better able to use their short-term and working memory. So for example, if you give kids longer instructions, go do this and then this and then this and then this, they can hold all of that information within their heads. Certainly much better than small kids can. On slide 47, we see that we are starting to get to levels of mastery in various skills and activities that they're doing. They're getting, good at I don't know, whatever is interesting to them, but also, maths and writing and things like that they do in school. And some of the factors that influence their ability to do better, to be starting to gain these early masteries, are experience. They've been around for like a decade now. That's a lot of years. Having the current opportunity to continue practicing those skills, and a personal motivation. So if they actually want to and want to get better at it, then that will certainly help. But also their level of brain development is very important. Their control processes are getting better. That frontal cortex is getting more and more developed. It's not going to be there yet, remember, until early adulthood, but it's better than it was in early childhood. And so they have better emotional regulation, better selective attention. They can tamp down their frustration better and hold on to their attention. They can pay attention and try again, even when they're struggling with something. And that's pretty huge for developing these new skills. Metacognition. So on slide 48, we also see in middle childhood, kids are starting to think about thinking. I think about this, but someone else thinks about this, and what does that mean? And so it's an increase of the theory of mind, but it's also the ability to strategize in ways that younger kids cannot. Kids in middle childhood will not just think, what's the best way to do this based on what I have done before or what somebody else told me to do, but what would I do if I were going to try to solve this problem? And they can make a strategy before implementing it, and that's really huge when you think about it. Our vocabulary is really growing. Kids have started school, and so part of this vocabulary increase that they're going to see is because they have to learn the words of school, but then also they're interacting in a new social environment, and so they're having a lot more conversations with people and developing those sorts of social skills with their use of language. So we start seeing that language is becoming more flexible and logical. They don't necessarily use things just exactly how it's supposed to be. They use a lot of slang, and they might even develop their own kid slang. They understand prefixes and suffixes and compound words and phrases and metaphors and figures of speech, things that 4-year-olds cannot get. 6 to 11-year-olds are really starting to understand that there's more to language and more to our ability to use language than just, yes, this is absolutely true, and if I think that, then everybody thinks that. The metaphors, kids start enjoying puns. You can see this in joke books that 6 to 11-year-olds are going to have. This unexpected answers to normal questions is really funny, and it's the first time that they understand why that is funny, and are able to do it themselves. They also understand the pragmatics of language, so that you would speak to your teacher differently than you would speak to your friend or your sibling. That certain situations call for a more formal type of language, other situations call for a more informal type of language, and kids figure out pretty well how to switch back and forth between those things. They call it like code switching, yeah? We also see this within our language development. As I've mentioned before, kids who have multiple languages that they speak figure out pretty early on as their first learning language when to speak which language. But then there are also, especially if they're starting to learn a language in middle childhood where their brain is not quite the same as it was in terms of absorbing language, there are a number of different strategies that schools may use in order to increase their second language development. One of these strategies is immersion. So basically the child goes into a school, it is entirely in the second language, and they pick up as they go along. That can be beneficial because if that's the only language that they're hearing, they become very motivated in order to learn the language because they need to in order to get by in the school. However, it can develop problems that even if they were ahead in certain areas, they suddenly fall behind in everything. So So when my friend Kiriko first came to the United States at like 9 years old, she did not speak any English at all. And the school that she was in did not have any language options for her, so she was just, an full immersion experience. The only class that she consistently did well on at that first early stage was math, which she was already pretty good at, and of course the numbers are the same. But of course there were some funny things. For example, when the teacher would be calling on students to give answers, she would answer in Japanese, and the teacher just, "That's correct," and would assume that the answer was correct. So to deal with issues like that, for example, she wasn't able to move forward in history or reading or any of those other things until she got her language up. We also have the option of bilingual schooling, and this is basically where some languages or some classes will be taught in the native language, some will be taught in the new language, and that allows them to develop their language skills while also learning other issues or other classes. Then we have our ESL, the English as a Second Language, in which students are taught English in a very intensive manner, and that then allows them to make up the courses that they might be starting to fall behind on because they do not yet have those language skills. All of these have their benefits and their downfalls. Some of them can be difficult. It seems to a lot of people as though bilingual schooling would be the ideal for most children. However, my other friend who teaches second grade in New York City, any given year she might have like 30 different languages represented in her second graders, and therefore they can't possibly have bilingual schooling for all of these kids. It's just not reasonable or possible, and so using ESL or even the immersion approach is probably going to be what would be most possible given that context. Come on, Valley. So on slide 53, you can see that there are some differences that we see in language learning, and actually poverty is a very strong correlation with language learning. And this is, whether it's English as a first language or second language, that doesn't matter, but developing the skills of language, grammar, writing, all of these different things. Part of it has to do with limited early exposure to words. We see that people who do not have high levels of education, if they're high school or maybe some college, tend not to read to their kids as much. They'll sing to them or play other games or things like that, but their reading becomes less of a priority, and so kids don't have that exposure to language that parents who have higher education rates are more likely to read to their kids, and therefore the kids are going to be exposed to structures and stories and words and vocabulary and things like that. Also, we have a difference in parents and teachers' expectations. And so if they are expecting that some kids are not going to achieve because of the stigmas associated with poverty, they're not going to push those kids to achieve as much as they would those kids coming from upper income families who maybe just have higher expectations pushed on them. On slide 56, we have our introduction to the idea of the hidden curriculum. The books that we learn from the how to read from, the stories that we hear, the histories that we are told, the example math problems that are given, oftentimes will have different cultural messages or values messages about how a child should be growing, how they should become a person, respectful and responsible, and all of these things. And that sort of information is what is in the hidden curriculum. It's things that we are teaching our kids, but it's not things that we are necessarily explicitly teaching our kids. So if we have a bunch of stories about, how children should be polite and respectful to their elders, then we would say that that's one of the values within the hidden curriculum. If we have other stories that are teaching like strong independence or something like that, then we would say that was part of the hidden curriculum. What they're actually reading, what the explicit curriculum is how to read, how grammar works, and what's the structure of stories and sentences. But the hidden curriculum would be that kind of information that is also being taught simultaneously, whether or not it's explicit information. On slide 57, we see that there are a couple of different ways that we can teach language. We have the phonics approach, which is sounding out letters, placing them together in different combinations, and then building words from there. The other approach is the whole language approach, where they teach reading by encouraging the use of all language skills, talking and listening, reading and writing. I see my nephews are going through the whole language approach right now, where they're taught to write out stories and, sentences and all of these things, even though they don't have a real understanding of like how to write words. So they sound things out in their mind, and they come up with all sorts of really bizarre spellings that make sense when you think about it. But I was taught with the phonics approach, where we started with the correct spelling first, and then later on would build languages and stories and things like that. And you're seeing with the whole language approach, oftentimes kids will develop a love for stories and language and things like that, and then later kind of put the rules of that language and the stories on top of the foundation that they've already built. Whereas with the phonics approach, we start with the rules of the language and then hope to build like the love of the language and the ability to construct stories and tales from there. Within our math, we don't have the terms listed here. Now let's go back. So within our math, we don't have the terms listed here, but we do have a term called New Math or Common Core, which is basically this focus on trying to understand how do numbers work with each other, and it focuses on understanding patterns within numbers so that we can figure out how to add and subtract and multiply and divide large groups of numbers, rather than focusing on a specific formula that will get us the answer, but we don't necessarily understand what the answer means or what the formula means. We just know that it works. I was taught that kind of traditional formula style where you carry the 1 and blah blah blah, but if you think about it, you're thinking about numbers. What does it mean to carry the 1? It doesn't mean anything. It's just part of the formula. I know that formula and I can do it. I can do it very well and very quickly because I've been doing it since I was a child. But the actual understanding how, well, if you're taking like, these multiple tens and then adding them with these other multiple tens or whatever else, like that new math approach is actually very easy and beneficial to kids who are learning from that approach. And so kids who started there and then move forward from there have a much better time understanding how numbers work with each other, whereas kids who started with more traditional based and then had to learn this on top of it, or goodness forbid, adults having to try to figure out what is going on in their kids' math books when they have no experience of it, that part can be very frustrating, the issue of the change. But it actually is kind of a beneficial process for understanding the nature of math. The last slide I'm going to focus on are some of the gender differences that we see in middle childhood. Girls do typically get higher grades than boys during this time. After puberty, we might see a switch with this, but girls' brains tend to be developing the processing power slowly, and plus their hand-eye coordination is developing more quickly as well. And so boys are lagging a little bit during this time, but social issues and other things will kind of come into play so that will reverse in a few years. And that's what we have for chapter 12. I'll see you back here for chapter 13.